During World War II, Allied soldiers feared German machine guns because of their extremely high rate of fire. The Germans, however, had their own nightmare: the raw, destructive force of the American M2 Browning firing the 50 BMG round. There's a reason it earned brutal nicknames like Meat Chopper. And while those names sound exaggerated, the reality behind them was far darker and far more horrifying for anyone on the receiving end. To understand why the M2 became so infamous, we need to go back to how it all began. During World War I, militaries quickly realized just how vital machine guns were on the battlefield. At the time, these weapons fired the same ammunition used by standard infantry rifles, but as new threats appeared, such as armored aircraft and the earliest tanks, it became clear that rifle-caliber rounds were no longer enough. The battlefield demanded something with far greater stopping power. Because of this, General John Pershing specifically called for a new machine gun capable of dealing with armored targets more effectively than the existing .30 caliber weapons. This task was assigned to John Moses Browning, the most renowned firearms designer in American history. Browning was given ambitious requirements: design a machine gun that could fire a half-inch projectile at speeds exceeding 2,700 feet per second, far beyond anything he had previously created. Rather than starting from scratch, Browning took his proven M1917 .30 caliber water-cooled machine gun and scaled the entire design up to accommodate a much larger cartridge. That cartridge itself was an enlarged version of the .30-06, with one key demand: it had to be rimless to ensure smooth feeding. The design also drew inspiration from captured German 13.2mm anti-tank rifle ammunition. The result was the now famous 50 BMG, officially designated as 12.7 by 99 millimeters. At the time, no one realized they had just created one of the most effective and versatile cartridges ever to see combat, one that would soon dominate battlefields around the world. After several revisions, the first prototype entered testing and was eventually adopted as the M1921. This was a heavy, water-cooled machine gun intended primarily for anti-aircraft defense. Additional testing explored other possible roles, but early results were not encouraging. For infantry use, the weapon was simply too heavy. The water-cooled version weighed roughly 120 pounds, while the lighter air-cooled variant still came in at around 84 pounds before adding a tripod weighing another 44 pounds. Altogether, a full ground setup could weigh anywhere between 130 and 170 pounds, not including ammunition, which was also far from lightweight. On top of that, the gun's powerful recoil made accurate, sustained fire difficult. Aircraft of the era were generally too small to use it effectively, and mounting it in early vehicle turrets caused problems as well, especially since it could only be fed from the left side. As a result, its primary role was limited to static anti-aircraft or coastal defense. Few could have predicted how dramatically that would soon change.
John Browning passed away in 1926, but development of his machine gun continued. Engineers refined the design, modifying internal components so the feed direction could be switched from left to right simply by changing the top cover. A universal receiver was also introduced, allowing the weapon to accept water-cooled barrels, heavy air-cooled barrels, or lighter air-cooled barrels for aircraft use. With these improvements, the concept finally came together. After further refinements, the weapon officially became the M2 Browning machine gun. While other nations were shifting toward larger 20mm and 30mm cannons, the United States believed the .50 caliber's high velocity, long range, and adaptability would keep it relevant. That decision proved to be absolutely correct. As a new global war erupted, the M2 was about to reveal just how devastating it truly was. Soldiers soon gave it a nickname of its own, the Ma Deuce, or simply the 50. The name came from combining mother and deuce, meaning two, essentially calling it the mother of machine guns, and as events would show, that description was surprisingly accurate. When World War II began, the M2 was already serving in a wide variety of roles. It was mounted on aircraft, installed on ships as anti-aircraft weapons, fitted to vehicles, and placed on tripods for infantry support. Few weapons were as versatile or as lethal. One of its earliest and most important roles was in aviation. innovation. Aircraft-mounted versions used lighter barrels and a dramatically increased rate of fire, boosted from around 500 rounds per minute to as high as 1,200. This was nearly the same rate of fire as the German MG-42, but for a different purpose. Air combat allowed only brief firing windows before targets disappeared from view. In some configurations, the M2 reached almost absurd levels of firepower. A perfect example is the B-17 Flying Fortress bomber. In its later G model variant, it carried up to 13 M2 machine guns, mounted in twin configurations across multiple turrets, providing devastating defensive fire against enemy fighter aircraft.
The P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bomber carried 8 of these heavy machine guns, 4 mounted in each wing. The Douglas A-26 Invader pushed things even further, fielding an astonishing total of up to 18 M2s. 8 were mounted in the nose, 4 in each wing, and 2 more placed in the turret. From the very start of the war, the M2 proved to be a massive upgrade over the lighter 30 caliber machine guns. It struck a rare balance between a high rate of fire and devastating single-round impact, more than enough to destroy enemy fighters or bombers. With armor-piercing ammunition, its rounds could punch straight through engine blocks, and when multiple M2s fired together, virtually nothing on the battlefield was safe. American aircraft frequently used 50 caliber fire to strafe locomotives, armored vehicles, and even tanks. This worked particularly well because top armor was almost always thinner than frontal protection. Before long, the heavy barrel version of the M2 became standard equipment on tanks, trucks, half-tracks, and nearly any platform that could support its weight. By 1945, millions of M2s had been manufactured, making it one of the most widely produced machine guns in history. German forces grew increasingly frustrated because American heavy machine guns seemed to be everywhere. Low-altitude attacks by aircraft, especially dive bombers like the Stuka, became far more dangerous since nearly every Jeep, half-track, or tank was armed with a 50 caliber weapon. On tanks, the M2 was typically mounted on the rear of the turret and operated by a crewman standing outside on the engine deck. This allowed the gun to be elevated and fired upward against aircraft, though it left the operator exposed outside the tank's armor. Before moving deeper into combat use, it's worth explaining a detail many people notice: why the M2's barrel moves backward when it fires. The weapon uses a short recoil operating system. When a round is fired, the barrel and bolt remain locked together and move rearward as a single unit. This keeps the cartridge case fully supported while internal pressure is still extremely high, preventing it from rupturing during extraction. After traveling backward roughly 10 millimeters, the barrel stops while the bolt continues rearward on its own. The spent casing is extracted and ejected, and the recoil spring is compressed. That spring then pushes the bolt forward again, stripping a fresh round from the disintegrating belt, chambering it, and firing the next shot. This cycle repeats continuously as long as the trigger remains pressed. Now, let's look at why German soldiers despised the 50 caliber so intensely. The most obvious reason was America's growing reliance on overwhelming firepower as a core battlefield strategy. Unlike the Germans, U.S. forces rarely faced ammunition shortages. It often felt as if anything with wheels or wings carried at least one heavy machine gun. Being fired upon by a 50 caliber was nothing like taking fire from smaller weapons, and its effective range far exceeded that of lighter machine guns. The difference becomes clear when comparing the 8mm Mauser round used by the MG-42 to a 50 BMG cartridge. The 50 delivers anywhere from 5 to 10 times more energy than standard infantry weapons. That meant buildings no longer offered reliable protection. Brick or concrete walls could be penetrated outright, and sustained fire focused on a single point could collapse entire sections of a structure or tear through sandbag defenses.
Even better armored German tanks, such as the Panzer IV, were not immune. Heavy 50 caliber fire could damage tracks, optics, and turret mechanisms, or penetrate thinner side and rear armor. In the Pacific theater, lightly armored Japanese tanks were particularly vulnerable and were often destroyed quickly, especially during mass infantry assaults where American crews unleashed every weapon available. There is also a long-standing myth that the 50 caliber was banned by the Geneva Conventions due to its effects on the human body. This was never true. However, the weapon's destructive power against human targets was very real. A direct hit almost always resulted in catastrophic injury or death. Many German soldiers witnessed the results firsthand, and the psychological impact was severe. When the enormous energy of a 50 caliber BMG round transfers into a human body, the results are so extreme they cannot be described here due to platform restrictions, but the comparison to what it does to walls or
solid objects gives a clear idea. Understandably, this forced German troops to change their tactics. Instead of frontal assaults, they relied on snipers, tanks, mortars, or artillery to eliminate American heavy machine gun positions. Adding to their frustration, Germany had no true equivalent to the M2. Their primary machine guns, the MG-34 and MG-42, were extremely effective, especially when mounted on the Lafette tripod, which provided excellent stability, accuracy, and range. However, the 8mm Mauser cartridge simply could not match the raw impact of the 50 caliber BMG. The closest comparable weapon Germany had was a 13mm heavy machine gun, but it was used almost exclusively on aircraft. There were plans to mount captured M2s on U-boats for anti-aircraft defense when surfacing to recharge batteries, and Germany even manufactured copies of 50 caliber BMG ammunition for this purpose. Actual deployment, however, remained rare, though it clearly demonstrated respect for the weapon's effectiveness. Before moving on to some of the more terrifying modifications made to the M2, it's important to understand the ammunition it fired. The standard load was a full metal jacket ball round, already capable of immense destruction. Beyond that, several specialized variants existed. Armor-piercing rounds could penetrate roughly an inch of hardened steel. Incendiary rounds were designed to ignite flammable materials, making them particularly deadly against aircraft by setting leaking fuel ablaze. There were also armor-piercing incendiary rounds that combined both penetration and ignition. Tracer versions added a visible trail, allowing gunners to correct their aim, especially useful for anti-aircraft fire or long-range engagements. Given that the 50 caliber BMG remained effective beyond 2 kilometers, this visual feedback was critical. M2 ammunition belts were typically loaded with a mix of rounds. For ground use, a tracer was often inserted every 5th round. Aircraft belts were customized for specific missions, combining armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer ammunition, depending on whether the task involved air combat or ground attack.
In the years following World War II, engineers continued experimenting with more advanced and specialized 50 caliber ammunition. One particularly interesting development was the Raufoss multi-purpose round. This single cartridge combined multiple effects: a tungsten armor-piercing core, a small explosive charge, an incendiary element, and fragmentation. In practice, it functioned much like a miniature 20mm cannon shell, except it fit inside a 50 BMG casing. Another advanced design was the SLAP round, short for Saboted Light Armor Penetrator. This type of ammunition works on a similar principle to the armor-piercing discarding sabot rounds fired by tank cannons. Inside the casing is a smaller, extremely dense penetrator, usually tungsten, encased in a sabot. Once fired, the sabot falls away, allowing the penetrator to strike targets at very high velocity. SLAP rounds offer significantly improved armor penetration and are especially effective against lightly armored vehicles or helicopters. Because of their cost, however, they're rarely used in automatic weapons and are more commonly fired from sniper rifles. Speaking of sniper rifles, the performance of the 50 BMG impressed the U.S. military so much that it eventually inspired the creation of rifles specifically built around the cartridge. One famous early example comes from the Vietnam War, where legendary sniper Carlos Hathcock experimented by mounting a telescopic sight on an M2 machine gun. Using carefully controlled single shots, he engaged targets at extreme distances where smaller caliber sniper rifles struggled. He even achieved confirmed kills using this unconventional setup. That experience helped pave the way for purpose-built 50 caliber sniper rifles, most notably the Barrett M82, often referred to as an anti-material rifle, which later became iconic in U.S. service. No discussion of the M2 would be complete without mentioning one of its most intimidating configurations, the Quad 50. When a single heavy machine gun wasn't enough, engineers simply mounted 4 M2s on one platform and aimed them at whatever needed to be stopped immediately. This setup was officially known as the M45 quad mount.
Originally designed for mobile air defense against low-flying aircraft, the M250 caliber's main limitation was its rate of fire and the brief engagement window when tracking fast targets. By grouping 4 guns together, that limitation was largely solved, sending roughly 40 rounds downrange every second. While Germany fielded even more powerful systems like quadruple 20mm anti-aircraft cannons, those were heavier and more specialized. The Quad 50, by comparison, was simpler, lighter, and far more versatile. The electrically powered turret allowed rapid rotation in all directions and could elevate nearly straight upward, making it easy to track targets. It could be deployed on the ground or mounted on vehicles, and before long, crews began using it against ground targets as well. Later in the war, as the Allies gained air superiority and no longer had to worry as much about enemy aircraft, Quad 50s became extremely effective tools for infantry support. Concentrated fire from 4 heavy machine guns striking a single point was utterly overwhelming. The Quad 50 did not disappear after World War II. It continued to see service in both the Korean and Vietnam Wars, and was often mounted on trucks to protect supply convoys from ambushes, a role in which it proved devastatingly effective.
From World War II to the present day, operating a 50 caliber machine gun has meant wielding enormous firepower. That power came with a serious drawback. Enemy forces prioritized eliminating 50 caliber gunners as quickly as possible. The weapon's distinctive sound, smoke, and muzzle flash made its position obvious almost immediately. Surprisingly, early vehicle and tank-mounted M2s often lacked protective shields for the gunner. Standardized protection wasn't widely introduced until much later, particularly during the Vietnam War. Even in more modern conflicts, early Humvee-mounted machine guns lacked adequate shielding, leading to severe losses from snipers and urban combat. These experiences eventually led to the development of armored turrets and remote weapon stations. Modern systems allow the gunner to remain safely inside the vehicle, operating the weapon using cameras and joysticks rather than exposing their upper body. These remote platforms incorporate advanced technology such as laser rangefinders, night vision, and thermal imaging, and they can mount not only 50 caliber machine guns but also other weapons like automatic grenade launchers. As for the M2 Browning itself, its story is remarkable. It began as a weapon that initially seemed impractical and limited, yet it evolved into one of the most enduring firearms ever created. More than a century later, it remains in active service with only minor refinements. The most noticeable modern update is the M2A1 variant, which features an improved quick-change barrel system, a flash suppressor, and a manual safety. Aside from these updates, the weapon remains fundamentally the same design conceived during the First World War. The MG42 is often praised for how long its design has remained relevant, but when researching the M2, often called the Mad Deuce, it becomes clear that its legacy goes even further back. Originating in World War I, it continues to serve as a highly effective platform with no clear retirement date in sight. Few weapons in history can claim such longevity.